There is a story they tell in McLean, Illinois, about a set of keys. When the men who built the place poured the concrete out front, they dropped the keys to the front door into the wet cement and walked away. On purpose. Because they had already settled the only question that mattered. That door was never going to be locked. Not at night, not on holidays, not ever. So why keep the keys? For 37 years, they were right. The Dixie opened in 1928, 2 years after anybody first painted the words Route 66 onto a map. And calling it a truck stop in those early days is generous. It was a rented corner of another man's garage. A mechanic's shop sold gasoline out front. And in one small piece of that building, a man named Walters and his son-in-law set up a lunch counter with 6 stools. 6 stools, that was the whole bet. And the road running past those 6 stools was not the highway you are picturing. Route 66, in 1928, was a promise more than a road. Paved in some stretches, dirt and gravel in others. A line being stitched across the country, one county at a time. There were no chains of clean lit stops waiting up the road. There was no up the road. A driver who got hungry or broke down or simply needed to close his eyes took whatever the nearest town happened to offer, which was usually nothing. That was the hole Walters meant to fill. Here is the part that gets lost. In 1928, the long-haul trucker was barely a job, and nobody had built a thing for him. There were no truck stops because there were barely any trucks. Walters looked at that empty highway and made a guess. The more pavement this country poured, the more those roads would need feeding. He wasn't serving the trucker, he was betting one would show up, so he went out and found him. Walters got in his car and drove the highway himself, up and down Route 66 as far as Kansas, telling every driver he could find that there was a good place to stop halfway between St. Louis and Chicago. He picked the name to do a job. He called it the Dixie because the word meant Southern hospitality. And a tired man 400 miles from home remembers where he got treated well. There was no other way to do it. The only advertising that reached a trucker in those years was another trucker, leaning on a counter somewhere, saying there's a place up in Illinois worth the stop. Then the Depression hit, and businesses up and down that road went dark. The Dixie didn't. It got busier. And part of the reason is something no modern accountant would ever sign off on. They gave the food away. If a man came to the back door hungry, he got fed. That was the rule. More than once, a broke driver or a stranded family got a hot meal and a full tank of gas and was sent on down the road with no money changing hands. When somebody needed more than that, the family made arrangements with a church in town. One of them said it plainly, years later. They just never let anybody get stranded. It wasn't charity for show. It was policy. And one night a week, they pushed a couple of rack wagons together in the back lot to make a stage, and they put on a free show. Music under the open sky in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. At intermission, the whole crowd came pouring inside for pie and coffee. That is the thing the polished version never explains. The Dixie didn't earn its loyalty by being the cleanest stop or the cheapest one. It earned it by feeding men when nobody else would, and those men did not forget. A driver who got a free tank of gas in the worst year of his life told that story for the rest of it. That is how a corner of a garage becomes a name handed down through a trade. Then the war came, and the weekend shows stopped cold. The Dixie kept running anyway, around the clock, year after year, through the war and out the far side of it. And around the clock meant something specific to the men who ran nights. A driver pushing through the dark hours could plan his whole run around that one certainty, that no matter what time he rolled through McLean, the lights would be on, the grill would be hot, and the door would not be locked. That was the real value of the keys in the concrete. Not a slogan, a promise a man could set his schedule by. Which brings us to the one day those keys would have mattered. On June 28, 1965, the original Dixie burned to the ground, 37 years of staying open, and the fire did in a single night what no blizzard or holiday ever had. It closed the doors, but not for long. One of the grandchildren later described it simply. Within about 12 hours, their grandfather was back out front, pumping gas and selling sandwiches to whoever pulled in. The family dragged a roadside cabin over next to the fuel pumps and worked out of it, flipping burgers and mixing milkshakes, until they could put up something permanent. And when they built it, they turned it around. The old building had faced the mother road. The new one, a place with 250 seats that opened in 1967, faced the other direction. It faced east. It faced the new alignment, where Route 66 was about to be swallowed by Interstate 55. Sit with what that means. The interstate was the thing that was going to kill Route 66, bypass the small towns, drain the old highway dry, put hundreds of roadside businesses straight into the ground. The towns the new 4-lane skipped did not decline politely. They emptied. A diner that had fed travelers for 30 years would suddenly sit on a road that no longer went anywhere, watching the traffic it lived on run past 2 miles to the east at 70 miles an hour, not from doing anything wrong, just from being on the wrong side of a line drawn in a state office. The Dixie saw it coming, turned its back on the road that had built it, and faced the thing that was killing it instead. And it worked. The Dixie survived the death of Route 66. It survived the bypass that buried its neighbors. It outlived the highway it was born on. So, you would think this is where the story ends well. The truck stop that beat the Depression, beat the war, beat the fire, beat the interstate. 75 years in one family, the oldest truck stop in the state, and a name every driver between Chicago and St. Louis knew by heart. It did not end well. What finally killed the family Dixie was never out on the road at all. It was on the books. The operation got ambitious. It expanded out to 4 locations, and the debt that came with that expansion grew heavier than the business could carry. By 2001, the company was bankrupt. And then came the other problem, the one that turned a failure into a scandal. Fuel taxes are not the operator's money. A truck stop collects them at the pump, folded into the price of every gallon, and is supposed to hold that money in trust and pass it on to the state. The margin on the fuel itself is thin. Pennies a gallon. The tax sitting in that account is not. For an operation drowning in expansion debt, that pile of money that legally belongs to somebody else is the most dangerous temptation in the business. The man running the Dixie, a great-grandson of the founders, was indicted by a grand jury, accused of skimming more than $400,000 of it. Money collected at the pump, owed to the state, never handed over. He avoided prison. The business did not get the same mercy. Creditors forced the filing, and the Dixie name, 75 years of it, was sold off to a corporation from out of state. It would pass through several more owners after that. The Route 66 Hall of Fame that had lived inside its walls was packed up and moved to another town. The truck stop is still standing. You can still pull off the interstate and get a meal, but the family that built it, the family that drove to Kansas to find its first customer, that fed strangers at the back door through the worst years this country ever had, was gone. And somewhere under the pavement out front, if the story is true, the keys are still down there, the ones they were so sure they would never need. They had the door right. They just had the wrong threat in mind. It was never going to be a lock that closed the Dixie. It was the people holding the keys,